Greenberg Traurig, if you don't know us. We're an international law firm. We have 38 offices around the world, 2,000 lawyers. I'm a patent attorney with a mechanical and biomedical background, so medical devices are my sweet spot, but we are a full-service law firm. Christiana is a products liability lawyer. Trevor, next to her, is a corporate lawyer. Karen Corolla is a FDA lawyer, regulatory lawyer, and we help medical device and med tech companies from their formation all the way through to financing, IPOs, try to keep them out of litigation, but if we need to, we bring in our big hitters to keep them on the path. So we're thrilled to be partnering with Device Talks. We've been partnering with them since they started this conference, when the ballroom was a lot smaller, but the questions were still good. So we're hoping you guys have some good questions. Today we've got a great agenda for this Hot Topics panel. We thought we'd touch on what's really happening in the device industry. What are the pressure points our clients are seeing and you're probably seeing as well? And of course, financing, getting the money to do the R&D is one of the big ones. How does IP play into financing, into exit strategy? What's going on in Washington with the FDA and the regulatory trends, and then products liability, how to avoid products liability if you can, or mitigate your risk if you get there. So we're going to look at these 4 topics over the next hour. Each one could probably be its own hour, but we'll go ahead and try to hit you with the high things, the high points of each topic. So enough about me. We've got a great panel today, real subject matter experts. I'm going to do a brief intro and then ask them to each introduce themselves and talk about what they're seeing in their area of expertise. We'll start to my immediate left with Christiana Jackson, who's a products liability lawyer. She's joining us from Greenberg's Atlanta office, where we have a real super team for products liability, representing some of the biggest products liability cases, but also counseling clients to not get into those cases. Christiana has a unique background for a products liability lawyer. She's got a master's in public health, which I think really helps her advocate for her clients. So Christiana, why don't you expand and tell us a little bit what you're seeing?
Sure. Well, I'm really excited to be here. I was trying to think if this is my 3rd, perhaps, here at the Boston MassDevice conference. So I always look forward to it. It's always a really great event with usually really interesting discussions on this panel. And as David was saying, my passion has been science. I have a chemistry degree and did research for a year before going to law school. So this is my sweet spot, what I really love doing. And generally what we're seeing, and we'll be talking about this more in detail, but on my side, we're seeing, the stakes have really been rising for medical device and med tech companies in terms of the litigation risk that's out there, as well as compliance risk as well, that I know Karen will be talking about too. But what I really enjoy doing is, in litigation, you're dealt a set of cards. You're dealt the documents. And so I really enjoy helping companies from a prospective standpoint, trying to mitigate their risk where they can.
Thanks, Christiana. And she came up from our Atlanta office, and I promised her I wouldn't mention the Super Bowl from last year. So
We're not going to talk about that.
We're not going to talk about that. But thanks for coming into the champions territory. Our next speaker.
Thanks, David.
Yeah.
Just a little bit.
Right? The Bills are in first place in the division. They did beat Atlanta as well.
Yeah. As a thank you, we're going to get her one of those shirts that show 28-3 in the 3rd quarter. So that'll be a big hit around Atlanta. But our next speaker is Trevor Chaplik, who is a corporate finance and M&A lawyer from Greenberg Traurig's Washington, D.C. office. He represents a lot of public companies, venture stage companies, and a lot of investors. So he's got a unique perspective he knows what the people with money are looking for and can help guide his clients to be able to companies that get the funding and get the exits. So Trevor, tell us a little about yourself.
Thanks. I've been doing this for over 25 years to age myself here, and as a resident of Washington, I've got nothing good to say about the Redskins, so I can't throw stones. I've represented both innovators and funds through the whole life cycle. I've probably made a specialty in exits, liquidity events, IPOs and M&A, and we're going to touch on the macro environment to set the panel up. Interestingly, I've also done increasingly a lot of cross-border deals, and it's, I was joking with Dave, I have no business doing that because I only speak one language. It's really been a disadvantage, but just have done it my entire career. And I'm going to touch, it's not on the slides, but I'll touch on the macro data as well through the first 3 quarters of exits in the IPO area globally. It's kind of very interesting. And I think we'll talk about, at least from my perspective, best practices, and I'll try to make it more universal. These would be practices that would help companies both through the financing process as well as exits, M&A or an IPO.
Thanks, Trevor. And next to Trevor, we have Karen Coelho, who joined Greenberg earlier this year. She was the former director of the FDA Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, as we call it, CDER. She was at the FDA for the last 6 years, was also in the FDA's Office of General Counsel. And we're thrilled to have her join Greenberg in early February, and I think you can figure out how that played out right after the change of administration. But she brings a unique perspective as a real FDA insider and helps guide our clients to try to navigate the tricky waters of the FDA.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity. I joined Greenberg, as David said, back in February. I didn't think it was a result of the change in administration, but after I left, I thought it was better to be a beneficiary of the change than a victim of the change in administration. So I'm very happy to be on the outside. This is an exciting time, a scary time because of the changes going on in industry generally. I practiced law for 27 years before I went to FDA. I was time to do something else. I had been in-house when I was about 7 years out of law school because I wanted to learn more about business. And after practicing law, typically on the defense side, representing industry, I thought it would be nice to see how the black box operates. And so I moved from Dallas to the DC area to work at FDA. And it was really a fascinating experience and really quite enlightening. Many people at FDA have been there a long time and have a very, very different view of industry than I did, coming from defending large companies. And so I spent 3 years in the general counsel's office where litigators do all commodities, all FDA-regulated commodities. And then I moved to CDER and worked in the Center for Drugs and spent the last 3 years in the Center for Drugs. So my device background comes from the chief counsel's office, but there was also opportunity at CDER to work across centers, which, as we'll discuss later, I really think is paramount to a more predictable regulatory environment for device and drug companies, and we'll get into some of that. So thank you for having me.
So thank you, Karen. So those are the Greenberg Traurig lawyers. Now the people you really want to hear. We're going to get to the fun intros. The first one is Peter Stebbins, who's the transaction lead for medical devices at J&J Innovations. I think one of the interesting things about Peter, he's been with J&J since 1990, since his HBS internship. And he started, I guess, working at J&J when he was 8 years old, if you look at that, in 1990. But he's been there up and down the food chain doing M&A and leading divisions in the US and outside. So he brings a real unique perspective. So tell us a little more, Peter.
Yeah, so again, for perspective from today, as David said, I've done strategic marketing as well as a lot of license and acquisitions, as well as divestitures. So I've kind of been at the side of the table trying to sell to a private equity firm or a competitor or a strategic. Most recently, last year or so, as you may know, Johnson & Johnson has set up the innovation centers around the world, one here, one in California, one in London, one in Shanghai. And so I've been involved in that organization on the medical device side. And where previously in my job as VP of Business Development, I was to the right, I'd say, of our venture capital arm, Johnson & Johnson Development Corp., where they were bringing me companies that they were investing in, and maybe I'd buy them or do a license. Now in this group, the Innovation Center J&J has really said we need to kind of go all the way in the very beginning of the ecosystem for lots of reasons. Number one is it's not clear how sustainable the pharma and med device ecosystem is without some more propping up at that seed stage and Series A transition. So now I'm working with companies in very early stage startups, in some cases forming companies coming out of universities and creating new cos, doing partnerships and potentially setting up into equity. And at this point, it's across the board from vision to surgery to cardiac to orthopedics and neuro. So looking forward to the discussion.
So thank you, Peter, for giving us kind of some insight to what's going on at J&J Innovations, and we certainly look forward to hearing more about that today. Last and certainly not least, we are excited to have Brian Rosnov as our final panelist. Brian is the Senior Director of Philips HealthWorks, and what that means, he's the co-founder of their external venturing in this area at Philips. Kind of similar to Peter, he's been at Philips for over 20 years, focusing on medtech and digital health, and he's had an exciting year really launching Philips HealthWorks as an outward face for Philips Venture. So tell us a little more about what's going on at Philips HealthWorks.
Thanks for the great introduction, David. And by the way, it's great to see a lot of friends in the crowd here. Again, I've been in the Boston community for about 20 years in various med tech roles. Grew up as an engineer, undergrad from Cornell, just as David. Later on in my career, did get my MBA from Sloan. Moved into more general management position, primarily in early days of wearables and wireless technology. So now all the rage, but back then it was a bit of a niche business for us at HP, then Agilent, then Philips. About 2 years ago, was asked to come down to Cambridge as we moved to open a new facility to think about how do we do a better job of engaging with early stage companies in Cambridge. And they figured, pick someone with no investment experience. So we've been figuring that out as I go. Honestly, it's been fantastic. Have really learned a lot from the founders in the community, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And really want to do, I think we really want to have a lot of impact here, not only in Cambridge, but we'll talk about what we're doing globally as well.
So Brian, why don't you continue kind of with your
All right.
slides and
Jump
give
right
us a
in.
little overview of what's going on at Philips HealthWorks.
Yeah, let's go to the next slide. Yes, so I'm going to give a little bit of just kind of a 50,000 foot view of Philips. Usually, when I was at the GT in March talking about this, we were just launching it, literally day 2 of the program. I kind of gave some numbers on Philips and focused on market share and focused on the big numbers you typically see in an annual report. But I chose to pick a few numbers here that I think are more relevant to our company. Philips is, by some accounts, the 3rd largest medical device company in the world. We spend a lot of time measuring, lives impacted on an annual basis, and today we believe we're helping the care of over 2 billion people worldwide. And for us, that's meaningful because we, as a company, have a target by 2025 to increase that to 3 billion. We think that having that kind of impact around the world is necessary to help the world, but we think it's good for all corporations to kind of look at look at their impact, not just bottom line impact. We invest a lot in R&D across the board, so close to $2 billion in R&D worldwide, and then given that, need a little IP statistic here. We are the largest patent holder or patent granted in Europe with almost 100,000 rights and trademarks. But I think what was interesting for us is as successful as we've been as a company, and again, in my 20 years have been involved with a lot of fantastic businesses, the challenges that are facing the world are significantly different than they have been in the past. Ranging from the change in demographics around the world, rise of chronic disease, just capacity and costs are out of control. That these challenges require really new ways of thinking, and I think this is one of the struggles that I think actually a lot of the companies that are well established in this space are having. How do we continue to run a fantastic business, but also address these larger issues as a world? At the same time, digital is affecting everything. We see that across the healthcare system. We're seeing that digitization asking patients to continue to take care of themselves even more and really be responsible for their own health care. Obviously, the change in the payer and the reimbursement market is having a significant impact, as well as just trying to do more in lower cost settings. So these challenges coupled with our capabilities, we really asked ourselves a simple question: how do we continue to support and deliver value to the world and bring new ideas, new fresh ideas into the company? So 2 years ago, I started to research that in Boston, and that, in the end, trying to answer that question became the seed for Philips HealthWorks. So if you move to the next slide. Yeah, so Philips HealthWorks, for us, is really a new way to engage with early-stage founders and early-stage health tech companies around the world. This is a picture from our pilot program that we ran this spring, excuse me. Fantastic program that we ran with 6 local companies, all based in the Boston area. When we built this initial cohort, what I really wanted to do is not only show Philips, what it means to really support a local founder community, but I also wanted to show Philips what, the amazing diversity we have in Boston and in the Cambridge area. Because our portfolio is quite broad. If you look at the Philips portfolio, it ranges from MRI equipment to toothbrushes. It ranges from all sorts of services supporting all those products and product lines. So this program that we created was really intended for early stage companies, seed, Series A type companies. We look at a broad range of opportunities at that space that really looking to build and grow adjacencies to our business. I think what's unique about our program is we do it all for free for the founder. So we are pretty selective in terms of who we admit into the program. I think our acceptance rate or invitation rate for this first program was under 2%. And what we spent 2016 in getting prepared for this program was organizing ourselves internally as a company so we can deliver value to some of the best founders in the world. And so one of the founders, called our program a buffet, a Philips buffet, and that's what we try to do. That we're not trying to, in the program, trying to teach founders how to be founders. We're not trying to tell companies what to do. We're trying to work as peers to the founders that are working on strategically relevant areas for Philips. We're trying to add value and work with them during the program on what their most current challenges are. And as part of that, we do have a venture fund that we've launched this year to support graduates of the program exclusively. Next slide. Our activities in Cambridge went so well, we've expanded this around the world, so we're actually currently running the same program in India, in Bangalore, India. We have similar programs running in Europe this fall in our Eindhoven high-tech campus. In 2018, we'll expand it to Shanghai, China, as well as Hamburg, Germany. But again, I believe just because of where we are here, the ecosystem, just the amazing talent and density of health tech entrepreneurs and academics and funding, I think Cambridge will be our largest operation around the world. Next slide. Yeah, and honestly, if you look at the core of the program, it's pretty simple. I mean, at the end of the day, when we spent all leading up to the launch of the program, we spent a lot of time just talking to founders. What is it that you're struggling with? And they all do say that at the early stages, there's funding needs and there's a bit of a drying up of fundraising and available capital in the market. But frankly, I think they just need to work with folks who are well established in the fields they're operating in. And what we've tried to do through the program and have done through the program is really organized our knowledge across the company, some of our assets, and as well, we share with the founders a lot of our relationships that we have both on the commercial side, on the research side as well. For us as a corporate, and I would guess Peter would resonate with this as well, we're in an era where we do really need new thinking, new ways to look at problems, and it's really tough to it's one thing to deploy new processes to try to change the perspective of your company. I think at the end of the day, there's new DNA, there's new talent that needs to be brought into large companies to drive some of these global problems and that we're looking for solutions for. And so for us, it's as much about really finding the best talent around the world, finding new ways to partner with them, supporting them in their journey to build great companies, and being a great peer to them. There are discussions, in our program whether we should, what should we do with these companies and how do we work with them post-program. With some it is investment, with some it's joint development agreements. We're going through a variety of options right now. But I think what was really exciting about this initial program is that it really was seen as valuable by the founders, because at the end of the day, we can have all these wonderful marketing slides, but if we're not delivering any value to the founders and the people who really are changing the world, it's not really meeting its purpose and mission. And so we're really excited about that. 2018, we'll do it bigger and better than ever. We expect to run 2 cohorts in 2018 here in Cambridge. And again, anyone who's interested after the program would love to talk to you. I think that's all I had.
Okay.
Good.
No, thanks for that overview, Brian. And I think one of the unique things when I was putting this panel together is I think bringing Brian and Peter together is really unique perspective, especially for the entrepreneurs in the audience. They're at 2 of the biggest healthcare companies, but they're really as far upstream as you can be, looking to bring innovation and to bring new ideas into the companies. And I think what we're seeing, not only Philips and J&J doing that, other companies as well, and a lot of that is because it's really hard to start a company now. Funding is a challenge, especially for the earliest stage companies. And I think that's going to take us right to our first topic, financing best practices. I'm going to turn it over to Trevor Chaplick, and I think we're going to see, he's going to show some stats, but it's tough out there. And if you're an entrepreneur, it's you got to kiss a lot of frogs before you find a prince or princess. So.
Thanks, David. So we thought it'd be helpful to start out and give the audience a macro perspective, if you will, of the health of the markets. We derived this data from PitchBook, but I was a little skeptical as to the results, so I drove our marketing group crazy and stress tested the data with another body of information from Capital IQ, and it all panned out. First couple slides, you'll see that venture financing has been a steady march up. Slight dip in 2016, probably just due to the uncertainty of the election. And I should say with all of these slides for 2017, this is 6-month data, so you have to double it basically and annualize it. The big picture for venture financing is we broke it between MassDevice and separately biotech pharma it's up, and it's been a steady climb up, and we think it looks like 2017 will be near the highs of 14 and 15. Conversely, very interesting story. If you go to the IPO exits, MassDevice is way down for the first 6 months, and this is where my skepticism really didn't understand it. And you get a similar but not as pronounced story for biotech pharma IPOs, and a lot of theories on that. It just may be the difficulty of going public these days. And I'd be interested to hear from Brian and Peter if you've got any perspectives as to why the data is like this.
I would say to some extent in 15, 16.
Pass in the microphone.
Yeah. There we go. So the window was a bit closed, as you could see earlier after 2008. And then so in 14, 15, 16, a lot of companies that were PMA type products that could go down a path of IPO took that window. And now it's not closed, but there just aren't as many companies who are, that have the right mix of sustainability to go public. And there's still, as you get to the next slides, talk about M&A exits. So that's, in some cases, there's still a good opportunity to have a good event in med devices by being taken out by a strategic. So again, in general, I think the IPO window is going to be pretty narrow for a while. I think we had the benefit of a flourish, and then it's going to settle down for a while.
Well, to Brian's point on the increasingly global nature of business, EY just came out with their 9-month stats on the health of the IPO market, and it was a different story than this. This is not in the slides, but it's a banner year globally, and I was very surprised by the breakout. Again, this is E&Y. U.S. I should say the Americas accounted for just 13% of the global IPO number and proceeds. Asia Pacific was far and ahead, the lead with 60%. There were 690 IPOs in the first 3 quarters of 2017, and 459 were out of China. So China is producing a banner number of IPOs. EMEA, which includes India in the definition, was about 27%. So U.S. has fallen far behind in that. So it's a very interesting perspective. I don't know, Brian or Peter, if you want to comment on that.
I mean, I think on the China piece, it's interesting that the government last year started putting controls on investment outside the U.S. So that ended up to really kind of continuing to heat up their internal market, because it's not impossible, but it's more difficult for Chinese investors to invest in the U.S. You know, I know of companies that had signed deals last year, and then they just couldn't do it because the government wouldn't let them transfer the whatever nominal $10 million. So the notion of how the Chinese government is running things is going to continue to heat up that market, and probably is somewhat underlying some of the reason for the IPOs, because there's just a lot of money that wants to get invested in health.
Conversely, different and more positive story on the M&A side. So MassDevice, this is the next slide, is trending way up. And if you analyze it, I think it could, it looks like it will at least equal the high of 2015. So a lot of M&A activity. It may be, it's just an easier way to get out and get exit, become liquid. Similar story to a slightly lesser extent with biotech and pharma, but the annualized trend is going to be up and certainly above 2016. If you guys have any thoughts on M&A as well, feel free.
Just want to now turn over to Brian. I think it's important for the audience to understand that if you look at the exits the last year, that if you break out traditional 510Ks versus PMAs and de novo 510Ks, and there's a good analysis, in the Silicon Valley Bank publishes information on a semi-annual basis, so their mid-year review kind of shows an 18-month trend in this. But the companies which have PMAs or de novo have been very successful for the venture capital companies. They have only had to invest for 5 years. They've had, I forget the number, but 4.5x return on their investment, because companies like us have been willing to buy them out upon good data. So only 5% of those companies have been U.S. approval, and all those VCs have had good success. On the other side, the traditional 510K, who, for different reasons, it got to avoid the potential issues with the FDA approvals, and things were nominally a bit more easy. They've taken 9.5 years to exit as a VC firm, which is a long time for a VC firm. And the returns have only been half that multiple. So what you're seeing unfold in the medical device side is, especially as we talked about the FDA with Dr. Schur and Dr. Mazel and those guys, they're actually getting pretty good at moving through important technologies through their approval process. And so you're really in a situation where 4 or 5 years ago the notion was, hey, maybe if you want to avoid the valley of death, it takes so long to do a PMA, you should try to make it do a 510K. Now the data is playing out the other way, where PMA, which you can actually have a liquidity event upon clinical data, may be a better way to go.
So we're going to segue to the next topic, which is our really best practices, both for financings and for exits. And I think the general idea is to try to get a smoother process, a faster process, and it's really in the interest of both companies that are raising capital, as well as from the perspective of acquirers or investors. I call it a universal approach. It's not the most exciting topic, but it's really fundamental, and it really starts with it's essentially a data site. Companies are now, in my experience, using data sites, even very early stage companies, for both M&A events where it's been more common, as well as financings. And really what you have to do from my perspective is ask counsel for a very good, comprehensive due diligence request list. Organize your site according to that, and it forces a discipline to populate that site. I can't tell you how many times I've been on the other side of transactions, either representing an acquirer or an investor, where we look at what's in a site and it seems light. And then we push and prod, and lo and behold, the number of documents doubles or triples because someone on the company side didn't put enough effort, oomph into the process, or wasn't thoughtful. And then, of course, that process leads to a reactive process on the company side because issues are then spotted. It's really, from a company side, spend time and investment. Another thing I've noticed as I go earlier on the spectrum for earlier stage companies, more and more now are almost all virtually in the cloud, and everything is electronic as opposed to paper. David and I share a company that's entirely in the cloud, even their ledger, everything. And what is helpful about that, even at an early stage, is they're ready to rock when it's time to do a funding event. They're very well organized. But let me turn that over to our principals to see if there's any perspective on that.
I know for me, just going through this cohort, that secure, to your point, they're already in the cloud, everything's in the cloud, so those who are able to set up this secure methodology for sharing that data, not only, they may be early stage, but they look very professional, it's just easier to work through. The one thing we struggle with, honestly, has been tailoring our checklist from what, for us, venture's new, comes out of the M&A world, and so, a 2 billion euro transaction is different than a $500,000 check, and so we've been tailoring that checklist along the way here to make it more reasonable, frankly, for the founders. I think we ask way too much, and particularly at the early stage, honestly, in the opportunities I look at, it's the founders that are the biggest risk. I think and we happen to have a program organized to help de-risk many other aspects of the company, and so. For us, the program, how they do in the program makes a big deal beyond just the documents they can provide us.
Yeah, and I think to Brian's point, we kind of highlighted some of the key areas where companies really need to focus from the start to get not only VC funding, but ultimately your exit. Yeah. And I think, we want to hear, from Christiana and Karen, I think one of the areas that wasn't on this list that really should be is starting at the very end, the products liability part, and working with companies early on so you're mitigating your risk for down the road events. So maybe Christiana, you can talk about the diligence you do in the company advising.
Yeah, we work with several of our clients, both looking at the risk in terms of devices that are in development in-house, but also in products that they're looking to acquire. And I can talk a little bit more in detail, but generally we're looking at what are the litigation risks that could face this type of product in the future, and that can help our clients in terms of thinking about valuing it, but also about mitigating those risks if it's one of their own products in development. For example, I had a client who had said, well, we're thinking about looking into this type of technology. And we said, well, are you aware that there is a massive multi-district litigation going on with hundreds of plaintiffs alleging particular design defects related to this type of device? So we want to provide you with some practical advice, not to stymie innovation, but to help kind of guide it towards a less risky path, where if they're having already some criticisms about the type of design device, perhaps that can help push the innovation in a direction to stay away from that risk. I wasn't sure from Peter and Brian's perspective if you all do, when you're thinking about the entrepreneurs and the new products, if you're looking into kind of the world of litigation and compliance risks and thinking downstream.
Certainly, yeah. Certainly compliance both from FCPA and other things is a big issue. And I'm struck by the notion of, especially in the cloud, having that be a bit of a checklist, that virtual data room be a bit of a checklist for an entrepreneur to be going down his or her path. Because one thing we find, I've been involved in some divestitures to include the carbon business we're spinning off now. And we find ourselves knowing the most about the business the day we sell it, because we really haven't organized our information and our thoughts in such a way that you could do that. And 10 years ago, it probably wasn't worth trying to do that work. But now, since it's all going to be virtual, and again, you don't want to distract people from innovating and building the just creating the company. But the notion of having all that information be kind of created with an end in mind, in terms of here's the data room for our financing, which will turn into the data room for our event, I think is really good. And it also allows some of those issues which people don't like to think about, such as some of the litigation risk and supplier litigation risk and things like that. And you have it on there on the list, and people have to get to it eventually, and they do it in the slow time, for lack of a better word. It's not really a distraction from the invention part. So I think it's a good idea.
And I think, Karen, maybe you can talk to kind of the diligence that you can do around the FDA and regulatory risk.
Brian, did Brian want to comment?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No,
After Brian's done
sorry.
commenting.
after I comment, yeah. So I mean, just a few things. One, we do, as part of our diligence, we look deeply at any IP or any filings, and again, that is an important aspect for us. Having that buttoned up tight and really having good counsel to support founders during that process makes a big difference, because there's real value there, and at least perceived or real, there's value there that comes out during the negotiation. Quality systems, honestly, it's in our experience, you see startups that have never thought about it because they're looking at it from a consumer angle completely. I think the best startups we work with are maybe looking at the consumer market as an entry point, but have really built their entire company around a strong quality system, a strong design controls methodology. And that, again, that's value. That's value. That's less work that we need to do later on. But again, I think what we try to do in our program is realize that the founders are best at the innovation they're bringing to the world. They may not be perfect in understanding all the other things, and what we try to do in our program is help them, coach them, and develop with them kind of better processes and methodologies so they can really secure their business, whether it's on the quality side, whether it's on the supply chain side, whether it's around IP.
Excuse me. So this is a tough topic from the regulator's standpoint, because the bane of any deal or the bane of any product being successful is regulatory approval or clearance. And regulatory predictability becomes so important, but it is almost impossible to control for, unfortunately. And what we'll talk about later is Dr. Gottlieb, who's the new commissioner of FDA, has been talking about how the regulators, the actual reviewers, as well as the FDA, has to transform itself in order to keep pace with technology. But I, unfortunately, have been disheartened by what I've seen on the outside, where companies have been in a development process with FDA for years, and they have sign-off by the reviewers on a certain development path, and they do everything that's been asked of them, and then they get a letter from FDA that says we have review issues, and they don't specify what the review issues are. There's a form letter that goes out, and then they go radio silent when the developer needs feedback. When the developer has gone to its board and explained, well, we've done everything we needed to do. We've done the trials, preclinical, clinical trials, and now we're just waiting for our approval, and then out of the blue comes a complete response letter or some form of bad news. And I had one expert who I was working with quoting Dr. Woodcock, who's the center director for CEDAR, when Dr. Woodcock was talking about the Critical Path Initiative. And this expert, who's a former FDA toxicologist, said that the Critical Path Initiative is who is your reviewer. And that kind of tyranny of personality can't coexist with a stable market and a stable development effort on the outside of FDA. I love the agency. I believe in the agency's mission, but some things have got to change, and I feel compelled as a lawyer and then a former FDA lawyer as well as a division director to find a way to do something about it. And listening to Brian talk about the work that he's doing at Philips HealthWorks, I think it might suggest a model for more of a partnership between industry and FDA, where that sort of agility and the fresh thinking can somehow break through the regulatory barriers. When I was at FDA, just as a side note, having spent 27 years in private practice, never took food and drug law in law school, and so it was all news to me when I went there. And there were certain catchphrases that I would hear people saying, like, "We never talk about drug pricing." Well, why not? You know, when you delay a drug approval or a device approval, twice the life that you expected, it's going to be reflected in the price of those drugs. And when a division refuses to be accountable for their decisions, but the entrepreneur or the company has to be accountable to its board, these are things that FDA, I think, needs to broaden its viewpoint and start thinking about and factoring into their decisions.
I actually have a question for Karen and for Peter and for Brian about the FDA's initiative on early feasibility studies and trying to push companies to utilize the early feasibility study procedures instead of launching into the full-blown clinical trials. And if you've seen more of the companies you're working with or you're utilizing that process.
So this last week they had at the AdvaMed conference in San Jose, Dr. Shurin, I mean, again, I'm kind of a fan since he's come in board, things have gotten better on the device side, but it's pretty compelling, kind of his town hall, and there's kind of three messages. One is this whole notion of certain number of pre-approval studies, but then also trying to do more real world, and really they're going to reorganize in such a way that their epidemiologists and the people doing the studies are, instead of different arcane specialties, now they're going to be like one group that just looks at evidence. Doesn't matter if it's pre-approval or post-approval. They're really going to have that notion of to get the best results for patients, we need to figure out the best way to balance that. So that was, I think, that notion of doing more. Related to that was a notion of getting more easy access to real-world evidence, and both from a company perspective and from a patient perspective, because sometimes it's kind of hard to get people to enroll. So they have this NEST, which I forget what it stands for, but basically the idea is to have public-private partnership, which really makes it easy to do medical device studies across the country. So rather than each division of J&J having to do a separate agreement with each investigator at each hospital partner separate from Cleveland Clinic, there's kind of a standardized menu. It's optional. You can be opt in or opt out, but basically allow that whole notion of getting clinical, both pre-approval and post-approval, much less bureaucratic and much easier to get involved. So I think that was great. And the third notion is this whole notion that they're kind of putting this super office of the product lifecycle office, where they're bringing some of their best people in there to help address anything which is above the normal. The bureau heads will still have or device branches or branch heads will still be doing the basics, but to try to really facilitate things for the more, if somebody does have a rejection letter, so that they have potentially 1 or 2 weeks to respond, and it has to get taken care of within 30 days, as opposed to potentially not even taking their call for 30 days. Right. So it's really, again, it all sounds good on paper till it's implemented, but right now it sounded pretty good.
I didn't realize I had to work so hard on this panel.
Yeah. Honestly, I was just going to comment on Karen's point about almost like the cult of personality. Who did you get as a reviewer? I can't tell you how many times we experienced that in the business that patient monitoring business that I ran back at Philips, and as an early stage company, things are risky enough. You don't need that risk in your life, and so anything that we can do to help that process, and again, for me, whether it's Philips, J&J, whatever, I think there's smart reasons why early stage companies should be partnering with strategics, because we've been through all these things. We can work with founders to really help their innovation get to market, because at the end of the day, we're trying to save lives here, and we're trying to do it as efficiently as possible, and there just isn't enough support, I think, for early stage companies to do that.
So I think, we've seen there's a lot of nuanced issues here. So I think, Trevor laid a great framework kind of looking at this from the corporate perspective. But I think, in the time we've got left here, we want to hear, I think, from some of the subject matter experts, from Christiana and Karen, talking about products liability and how that can impact things, and then the FDA. So I think we'll turn it over to Christiana to give us a quick primer on products liability, and then we'll circle back to FDA and then tie it all together. So.
Great. I'm going to stand up here too. And I think you're going to hear a lot of this from Karen as well, but there's such a tie, as you guys know, between the compliance world but also the litigation world, and this kind of circle, although it seems a little intimidating, but it is the world of litigation that medical device manufacturers can face, and it's really intertwined with both allegations of product deficiencies, but also with compliance issues as well. Let's see. So, what we've been seeing over the last few years is really a dramatic increase in the number of claims and the size of the verdicts. And then basically the stakes are just getting higher for companies. And so I give David a hard time a lot for letting me go last and be this word of doom and gloom, but that's not really why I like doing this. I like doing this to tell you guys that really the best, well, we won't go into the details of football, but really the best defense is a great offense. So building your companies with good quality systems in place, trying to build yourself from the beginning really is the best way to prevent some of this litigation from occurring. And so this slide really talks about federal multi-district litigations over the last 20 or so years, and you can see this dramatic rise. And back in 2013, 2014 is when we saw the largest multi-district litigation in U.S. history involving transvaginal mesh devices. It's still going on, and so you can see the number of individual lawsuits. So the number of individual people who brought lawsuits had reached over 95,000. Against several different manufacturers, and the drop this year is because many of them are settling their lawsuits, and a few of them are going to trial. And so the types of claims that we're seeing really are reinforcing this intersection between product deficiency allegations as well as compliance issues. And what the plaintiffs' bar loves to do is they love to have the government, the FDA, do their work for them. And so what we see is if there's a recall, if there's a warning letter, that all becomes publicly available on the FDA website, and plaintiffs' lawyers set their little tinglers, and they can get an email that day when a new warning letter is posted, when the FDA issues a new safety alert. And probably within the day or the next day, you're going to see massive plaintiff advertising. Have you been implanted with a mesh device to treat your hernia is probably what you're seeing currently on TV, right? That was as a result of a market withdrawal. It wasn't even a recall, it was a market withdrawal. And then there was a recall of another product, and now we just see massive litigation going on again. So these are the most recent multi-district litigations. These are in federal court. And there's usually a coordinated state court action as well. These are the most recent ones that were formed this year. And what I found interesting in listening to Peter talk in terms of the trends that he's seeing in terms of the pathways between PMA and innovative 510Ks and traditional 510Ks is that The devices that are under fire currently in litigation are the traditional 510Ks. And the allegations are that generally there wasn't sufficient data to support their safety and efficacy. And in the litigation, they look very closely at the predicate devices that the 510Ks are based on and the safety data that supported those predicate devices. So what was the literature saying about those devices? How thorough was the testing of the predicates that these traditional 510Ks are on? So you really see the 510K under fire currently. Let's see. So this slide shows just some of the recent verdicts. So in addition to the number of lawsuits being brought increasing, the amount of the verdicts are dramatically increasing. And you can see currently it's not going as well for some of the mesh manufacturers, resulting in some very large settlements as well. And these are some other types of settlements and verdicts. You all probably, there was the $1 billion verdict back in October, really, that came out, a big news item. That was for 4 plaintiffs, so one person did not get the $1 billion. It was for 4 of them. Yeah, so a little measured, not really. So, what can we learn and take away from this? And the one is just, like I'm saying, the number of claims are increasing, the verdicts and settlements are getting higher, and so the stakes are just getting higher out there. And that's why starting to look at things early and thinking about these things early can really help a company later on. And in addition, when you have like some of my clients who are looking at these when they're looking to do an M&A deal or acquiring or thinking about a new product development line, they are looking at this. They are looking to see what does the litigation look like right now for this type of product. So these are things that they are looking at. So risk mitigation, some proactive activities, and I know Karen will echo this, but developing that robust compliance program, at least putting the pieces together in place so that way on the back end, you're not getting some questions about the compliance that you have in place already when you're going through the due diligence process, for example. And conducting that risk assessment at all stages of the product life cycle, just doing a check, just seeing what's out there. What are the allegations of device deficiencies being made right now? There's also some early considerations in terms of insurance. I think companies sometimes think, well, I can just go get myself some insurance to cover product liability claims. And I don't know Peter and Brian's thoughts on that, but it is difficult these days to get. I see Brian laughing down there.
For high quality product versus insured. Yeah.
Yeah. It is very rare and difficult to get that kind of insurance because the insurance companies are also seeing these types of claims that are out there. And I think also early on in terms of mitigating risk, thinking about your warning, your labeling documents goes a long way. Many of the claims that companies face are allegations of some type of failure to warn of a risk. And so really making sure that you have a robust labeling can go a long way to mitigating risk down the line. We help, I actually have a training session on Wednesday with a client. I had one last week to really proactively help employees think about the documents that they're creating and how they could be used in a litigation later on. So training even folks like engineers who are like, I have nothing to do with litigation, but really they are the heart and soul of our defense, right? They're the ones who establish the device is safe and effective. So we need their documents, the design history files, to be the best documents because that's really the proof, that's the evidence later on. So trying to work on some types of writing tips, staying away from red flag words that give me heartburn when I see them. Things like, defect, and we don't need to talk about legal terms like that. We can stay away from those. And thinking about even things putting in place and keeping an eye on your reporting and the types of complaints that you're getting in, because I think that going a long way in terms of real life use of the product can give you a good idea of potential risks that you could be facing. And doing these risk assessments that we've been talking about and being proactive and looking at similar products, similar patients, and both both within your kind of product type, but perhaps other product types that are used to treat the same condition as well. So kind of thinking broadly, because the litigations tend to focus in groups on both device types, but also as condition types too.
Thanks, Christiana. And I know we're jumping around here, but we're running tight on time. And that was a great products liability risk mitigation overview. And Christiana will be here afterwards, and she's a real wealth of knowledge on this topic. And I think we want to hear from our other expertise. Fresh from the FDA, we want to hear from Karen to tell us, kind of the insider's view about FDA, what's going on in the 5 minutes we have remaining, and then we'll tie it all together before that. So.
Thank you, Dave. So you walk around this conference and you can see some really crazy stuff, very Star Trek-y stuff going on here. Like the session before was 3D printing and printing parts for the body that will be implanted, and virtual reality to allow a patient to experience the results of the treatment or the surgery. The big data opportunities, these are all, of course, intensely technologically advanced. And so what we hear coming out of the agency, especially with Dr. Gottlieb taking the helm, is a more hands-off approach to the kind of devices that we're talking about here, the mobile medical devices and digital health. He was quoted recently that there are 165,000 health-related apps for smartphones and 1.7 billion downloads of those through 2017. So what does all this mean in terms of what you can expect from the regulators? What Dr. Gottlieb talks about, and what was actually in place even before he got there, was regulating to innovate, which makes my head explode, obviously, because can those two things coexist? And it's heartening to see what Dr. Gottlieb is putting in place, and particularly CDRH is doing on the device side, taking a much more hands-off approach, learning from the experts, and the developers are the experts, allowing a more agile paradigm. And in my next slide, I'll just talk very quickly about a few things that you may have already heard about. This refocus on risk, which is behind the 21st Century Cures Act. Many of the provisions of that act talk about FDA declaring itself not to be regulating certain mobile medical devices. Those devices are things that you might expect that don't really touch the patient. And in the world of FDA, it's all about intended use. So if your product is intended to be used in a way that would not directly impact patient health, it probably either won't be regulated or will be exempt from regulation, or maybe just a Class 1 device. But it's important to specify the intended use and to understand that going in. Anything that is marketed to the physician to help the physician with the diagnosis would probably be regulated far less than something that was intended as a diagnostic device without physician intervention. So those are some parameters that you might consider when you're thinking about your device and how FDA might be regulating it. The refocus on risk is just all about asking the question, how risky is this, and should FDA be allocating very limited resources to a low-risk device? Regulatory ambiguity kills innovation. I was talking before about the regulatory predictability. And so what Dr. Gottlieb is doing is trying to clarify policy so that when you undertake your development, you can be more certain of the outcome in terms of how the regulators are going to view it and control the process. I am a big fan of FDA guidances. If you're unfamiliar, go on the website, and if it's a device, go to the CDRH tab, and you can search for any guidances. They're especially helpful now because CDRH is cranking them out. The 21st Century Cures Act had required certain guidances on the level of regulation for medical devices, high-tech medical devices. And so I just checked, there was one that came out August 31st. If you're interested in these, you should sign up and get the alerts. And the one that just came out was something that Peter talked about, which is the use of real-world evidence in device approvals and clearances. And it's FDA's thinking. They're not, they don't bind the agency or the sponsors legally, but it's a way to understand the agency's thinking. And just between us, it's a way to not have to write a regulation, right? Because it takes forever to get regulations through. So FDA can write something that is not binding, so therefore it's not violative of any administrative procedures, but explain how they interpret certain things and what you might expect.
So 1 hour flew by. I think we could have filled 2 or 3 hours with this panel here. But we know we stand between you and alcohol, which is never a good place to be. So we're going to ask the panelists to look in their crystal ball to close things off. What do you see for the rest of 2017? And what do you see for the outlook? And what issues should entrepreneurs be looking out for? We're going to start with Brian at the far end and work our way across.
Could one person just talk about budgetary issues when you're thinking about a startup? I think the overview is fantastic, but when some of us are out raising $10 million and we're really trying to picket that IP fence on an offensive strategy, there's an argument to spend $1 to $2 million of that, and not a single VC is going to fund that. So,
But your patent attorney will be very happy.
yeah, exactly. Well,
Maybe Brian, you know, you deal with that.
David, I was going to say you're the IP attorney here, so.
But what do you think, how do you think companies should be looking at budgets when they're on a shoestring, but they know they
Yeah, I
need
know.
a bigger pile of cash?
It's really hard to comment on without knowing your specific situation. And in particular, are you a software play? Are you a device play? Are you a therapeutics play? At the end of the day, only you understand where the real value in your company is, and you need to be investing to drive that value and to protect that value. So in some cases, my opinion, putting more money into building that fence around your IP is a big deal. It makes a whole heck of a lot of sense if you can afford to do that. In other cases, you know, is the IP going to be granted? I have no idea. I mean, I've seen people spend a ton of money on IP, and it's just flushing money down the toilet, basically.
So
That's my opinion. That's my opinion in there.
And Karen, what do you see? What do you see in your crystal ball coming up from the regulatory side over the next 6 months?
I think the news is good on the device side. I think that what I've said recently in an interview was that you are the experts on your technology, and you should not be cowed or intimidated by the regulatory process, because I firmly believe that if you approach the agency as a partner, equally motivated to get good products to market as quickly as possible, you can work together. I have seen more responsiveness to that than not, although some of my clients have been on the receiving end of the not side of that, which is part of the problem is, I think, insecurity on the part of the regulators who just cannot know your technology as well as you do. And so I think you just need a gentle touch when you're dealing with the agency, that you're in it together. It sounds sort of corny and Pollyanna-ish, but I do think that you need a friend in the regulator until you have to take the gloves off. I never quite understood if it's gloves on or gloves off, but until you're ready to fight, you really want to be in it together with the regulator. But I think the news is good in terms of having the watchword on the device side be innovation first, and regulation will fit around that.
So Karen's ready to sing Kumbaya with the FDA until she's got to knock them out. So. And Peter, what do you see?
I think one of the interesting things to follow the rest of the year and into next year is what happens with mandatory bundling. Secretary Price was, as an orthopedic surgeon, was against that notion. He wanted to be very much, you know, let the not force anybody to do that. So to some extent, depending on who your replacement is, may have an impact. And the reason I think it's important is because that bundle is the one area that really unlocks all the different types of innovation in the ecosystem, because it gets into wearables and rehab and prehab and just everything having to do with a patient's experience from day one until 90 days later, and really kind of goes away from this notion of, all right, in the hospital, what are we paying for? Even if it saves money and lives later, it doesn't matter. If that becomes a forced thing, that's going to really, make a lot of different elements important, not just the surgical episode, but also the monitoring and things like that. I'm not sure who's going to pay for it all, but at least all those things we brought to bear with some skin in the game, as opposed to, gee, it would be nice, but follow the money, there's no money, so we're not going to bother having that monitor.
Excellent point. And Trevor, what are you going to tell the entrepreneurs and the companies out there?
Well, as a deal attorney, I feel it when the market is up or down. There's either reach out or not, depending on what clients' needs are. And as we discussed earlier, the macro trends, particularly globally, are really up. It's a banner record year. Just at breakfast in the hotel this morning, the lead was, stock market's record high in the U.S. So, it's a complex world, though. And what I've seen over my career is if there are external shocks, whatever that may be, that changes everything. So, but absent external shocks, I think for both financings, there's a massive amount of cash resources available for investment and acquisition. I think there's really a reason to be optimistic, both domestically and globally.
Thanks for that perspective. Christiana, wrap it up for us.
Well, again, I see 2017, I think the focus, like I've been saying, is on the devices that go through the traditional 510K process. That's where plaintiffs are seeing an easy litigation target currently. PMA devices, I know we didn't talk about this, but they have a very special and unique litigation defense that bars these types of claims called preemption. And we've seen some recent very good decisions really narrowing and dismissing claims if it's a PMA approved device. And so I see the risk still there with traditional 510Ks, particularly ones that were approved back in the 80s and 90s, where perhaps the data the real life data, even though it's been on the market for 30 years, hasn't really been there to gather and to support the safety and efficacy of the device. So I still see those as being the challenge for companies going forward.
And I think, as the patent attorney on the panel, my words of wisdom are, I think what we're seeing is, as far as patent goes, it's quality, not quantity. And I think you really need to focus on getting bulletproof patents that are going to stand the test of time and really carve out some white space in the marketplace. That's what Brian and Peter are looking for. They'd rather have one silver bullet patent than 10 patents that are going to blow over if they're pushed. So I think you really got to focus on quality, not quantity. And I think in this panel we had both quality and certainly quantity. We could have used some more time, but we appreciate you bearing with us. And let's have a big round of applause for the panelists.
Thank you, Dave. Really appreciate that. Great conversation.